Right. All right.
Well, good morning, everybody,
Hello.
Morning.
and welcome back to session 2 of Wallowing in Watergate. Before we start on this morning's agenda, does anybody have any questions or comments to follow up on last week that we didn't have time to get to? I didn't want to cut off discussion on the actual.
Oh, we should introduce Eleanor.
Oh, Eleonora is here. Eleanor, you want to introduce yourself?
No.
Make up things about you.
I'm just a newborn baby, so sure I have been here 3 years, not adapting quite well, so whatever is transplant, it needs time. I think that will be the rejected one, so shortly that's it. Thank you.
Bob wants to tell you.
Can I go to the bathroom?
No.
So what was the day and date of your first date?
It was Saturday, June 17th.
Okay, where were you on Saturday, June 17th, 1972?
I have no idea. I have broken in school. School then June 10th.
And where?
Macedonia. Yes. So I was like finishing grade.
Yeah,
That's the she's finishing third grade.
Oh,
New baby.
Thank you, Eleanor, because I was the youngest one in the room last week, and now that's you.
Okay, on that humble note, the oldsters will start.
All right. So today's agenda, Lance, welcome on Zoom. You're the only Zoomer this morning, but welcome.
Hello, Mark and Mary.
Okay, today's session, we're going to talk about the break-in at the Watergate office building. We're going to talk about the subsequent prosecution, and we're going to talk about the formation of the Senate committee and the staff, and get to some of the questions that were raised last session, but we didn't get to because we were hoping to do those today. So when we left our story, John Mitchell had just resigned as Attorney General and moved over to become chairman of the committee to re-elect the president. So let's go to the committee to re-elect the president. Why do we have a whole separate committee to run a campaign, a presidential campaign in 72? Why do we have something called a committee to re-elect the president?
And why do we have a name called Creep?
And we always call him creep.
Well, the
Wait a minute, so
basic,
nobody has any idea? I mean, he's got this huge staff in the White House, why doesn't he just use them?
Well, did they have campaign finance laws then that are different?
There we go,
yes,
Joyce.
absolutely. There's a law called the Hatch Act.
Yes.
The Hatch Act prohibits any political activity by public employees on public property using public resources. And so generally speaking, when incumbents decide to run for re-election, they set up a whole separate campaign structure apart from their official offices in order to forestall any kind of concern or crossing the lines between political activities and official activities. Now, sometimes it gets a bit blurry, and sometimes it's pretty clear. You may recall in the 2000 presidential campaign, Al Gore had to deal with the fact that it was earlier than that. He had to deal with allegations about doing fundraising calls from his official office, and nobody ever prosecuted that, but it was really pretty clear that that was over the line and shouldn't have been allowed. So when you set up a separate committee, it's basically to ensure that there is a clear line between, or wall between political activities and official activities. And ironically, this committee ended up blurring the line going back in the other direction. So set up initially to ensure that there wouldn't be any kind of crossover. It actually created the crossover that it was designed, that it was set up to avoid, which is kind of the irony of it. So we get to why did it go off? First of all, Why did they name it the Committee to Re-elect the President? Any ideas? Did anybody?
Did they like the acronym?
Could have. No, it was mostly because they discovered that Nixon as a name, the Committee to Re-elect President Nixon, was far less popular than the president. And so they decided to go with that. I don't think anybody thought about what the acronym might be at the
Until the
time.
Democrats.
Because if they would have, I'm pretty confident that they wouldn't have involved that. Anyway, part of what they set up, in addition to the campaign mechanism, the fundraising mechanism, marketing, voter turnout, voter registration, etc., they also set up a counterintelligence function under G. Gordon Liddy, listed there. All these people, whether it's John Mitchell or Maurice Stans, all these people were basically Watergate defendants subsequently, except for two people. The two people that shouldn't be on this list are Hugh Sloan and Bob Reesner. The reason for that being they were two of the Committee to Re-elect the President employees that were quite straightforward and honest and did not get indicted and did not go to jail. Sloan was the treasurer of the Committee to Re-elect the President. And he, after the burglars were caught in the Watergate offices, he looked into what he'd been providing funds for to Gordon Liddy, realized it had been for illegal activities, and decided he would get out of Dodge. So he resigned as a matter of principle. Bob Reesner was the administrative assistant to Jeb Magruder. And in fact, Bob Reesner was one of the heroes, one of the unknown heroes of Watergate, because he testified honestly about what Jeb Magruder had told him after the break-in, and contradicted Magruder and implicated Magruder quite significantly, which took a lot of courage at the time.
Wait a minute, though, I don't want to be too sort of snippety over here, but these guys knew at the time. I mean, good for them that they didn't lie to us, but Hugh Sloan, his solution was to quit. His solution wasn't to set matters right. It wasn't to bring it to somebody's attention. It wasn't to be the mature voice in the room. It was merely to get out of Dodge. Well, good for him, right? And same thing with Reesner, who ends up being a really nice, good friend of ours. But he too was a young guy, stuck being told to do something. I don't even know if he did it, but he certainly was forthright.
He had no culpability whatsoever in the break-in or the cover-up, apart from the fact that
he knew it was going
he testified about what Magruder said to him, and that's what was important.
All right.
So how did this whole enterprise go off the rails? It was a plan called the Gemstone Plan. The Gemstone Plan was what Gordon Liddy designed to interfere with the Democratic primaries and try and produce George McGovern as the Democratic candidate as opposed to Ed Muskie, as well as infiltrate the Democratic campaign and the Democratic Party to get political intelligence for the Republicans. And that's basically what was going on.
Do you think they were successful? I mean, Muskie ended up not being.
Well, it was very successful in the sense that Ed Muskie was not the Democratic nominee. But that really wasn't clear whether it was because of any of the activities of Gemstone. It was more a result of some of incidents that happened in New Hampshire during the primaries, and Muskie allegedly crying
Yeah.
at the mention of his wife's name in the
Yeah, but was
New
that a
Hampshire
setup?
newspapers.
Was that a setup?
We didn't never really determine that. It was done by there was a Canuck letter that was sent in New Hampshire, and it was not clear whether it was sent by Donald Segretti or any of his operatives. Segretti is on the list there because he, as we'll see a little bit later, had a whole network of political operatives that were designed to infiltrate campaigns and report back. Now, it turns out I subsequently worked for a senator named Ed Muskie, And it turns out that during this campaign, he set up a separate committee from his Senate office committee. So he had a separately located campaign committee. He had a driver that went back and forth between the two offices. Muskie, to carry documents. One of Segretti's operatives was a gentleman by the name of Elmer Wyatt, who Segretti was able to bribe to stop on his way to Muskie's campaign office at the creep offices so they could make copies of Muskie's documents before Muskie's office received them. They had no idea that their driver had been compromised.
And some of Segretti's carried gun, he sent a bunch of pizzas. It sounds like it's nothing, but it's hundreds of dollars.
Yeah.
And recently, I don't know if you've noticed, but recently some of the federal judges and district judges have been receiving unrequested pizza deliveries, which is a violation of, it's expensive and it's potentially dangerous. Well, these are old tricks that Segretti came up with, college pranks.
So what was the purpose of sending the pizzas?
To disrupt the fundraiser.
Yeah.
So
No, and to the judges, it was harassment. But for this, it was to cause the campaigns to have money, to have to pay for things, or look like they were being,
And to judges, it's also to threaten them.
it is definitely.
I know where you live. And
Right.
if we can send you pizzas, we can do more.
That's right.
What's that called now? Just
Swatting.
what?
Swatting.
Swatting.
Oh,
So that's happening now.
Yeah.
So-
what is it called now?
Swatting.
Oh, swatting. Yeah.
It's like sending the police to your house saying that there's a.
or something like that.
Right.
So some things just never change.
Well, what's interesting is that part of what the mentality was at Crete was that the Kennedys did this to the Republicans. And so they thought they were doing something that the Kennedys had done to them. Now, there's no proof, we didn't have any proof of that,
They're probably
but I'm not sure I would go in that direction.
Outstanding person.
There's no doubt about that.
Hey,
So why did they go off the rails?
So this whole plan, this gemstone plan, and the reason it was called, they called it gemstone, Liddy did, because they had a ruby, and they had a sapphire, and they had a diamond, and they had all sorts of other gemstones who were operatives that they wanted to place in different.
They called it by the stone name.
The gem names, please.
Right.
They were stoners.
I'm sorry?
They were stoners.
Or they were stoners.
Right.
Sometimes it's good.
I do have-
to hear.
I do have a question. So where, going back to the last, where does White Chapin fit in all of this?
Chapin was still working in the White House, so he's not officially in the campaign, but he's the one who hired Segretti.
Yeah.
And for a while, we actually thought that Segretti was a bigger deal than in fact he was. When I first came to the committee, there were two theories about the break-in that occurred. One was that it was done by a kid named Michael Moore. It was one of Segretti's acolytes. The reason was because Michael Moore's mother was a secretary at the Federal Reserve in Washington, and that office was right above the Democratic National Committee offices. So they thought, oh, that's the connection, Segretti. That was one. The second one, and so I got to investigate that very briefly because it clearly was wrong. The second one was that, actually I'm blanking on it for a minute. The second one had to do more with having one of the senior moments.
Is that right? All of a sudden we're
It's going to be back to run it back to what?
No.
Second theory is from the break in telephone.
The second, no, I'm just.
Oh, we're going to just move right along.
Well,
One of the,
Oh,
right, go ahead.
no.
I was going to say, you're also talking about just the attitude within Crete, that in fact they would be able to consider some of this behavior as being appropriate behavior, a behavior you do on behalf of getting somebody reelected. I mean, it's ridiculous. If your kids came home and talked about this, you would say no. But these are grown-ups thinking, yep, this is just the way to go. And so this attitude gets them into deep trouble.
I think it's fascinating, but one of the questions I have is, how much effort did it take to kind of peel off all the layers of the onion? Were people willing to talk, or did they put up, walls against?
No, actually, it's interesting, a lot of people would talk. I mean, I was surprised that we didn't encounter more resistance
But
along the
remember,
way.
at this stage of the story, I think it's important to keep a list and keep an attitude toward the chronology. Committee doesn't exist right now. This is just stuff that's going on. It hasn't gotten to the peak yet where people are leaving their jobs, being indicted, going to jail. It hasn't happened yet. This is just, it's just beginning. Lacus hasn't been hired.
Actually, I just remember the
There we
second,
go.
the second cockamamie scheme that people were thinking about had to do with the second or third day I was on the staff. I got a call from a fellow up at the Permanent Investigations Subcommittee of the Senate. It was one of the standing committees, and so I went up to his office, and he was very surreptitious. I mean, he would look both ways before he talked to me. He'd close the door, open it, close the door again. So he said to me, now, I don't want to reveal this to the public. And I said, Jack, don't worry. I'm not speaking to reporters these days. And he said, well, let me show you. And so he pulled out the top drawer of his desk, and there was a very grainy picture, black and white picture. It looked like, you couldn't tell what it was because it was so unfocused and blurry, but it was in black and white. And he said, do you see that person right there? And I looked at it and said, it's hard to see a person there. And Jack said, it's a person, it's clearly a person. I said, well, who is it? He said, well, it's Howard Hunt. And he said, do you know where it was? And I said, no. He said it was November 22nd, 1963, and it was in Dallas, and Howard Hunt was on Kennedy's plane. So I said, are you serious? So I went back down to our offices and I told my boss about this new theory of the break-in. And Terry said to me, if you couldn't recognize anybody in the picture, let's check the manifest of Kennedy's plane. And Howard Hunt was not on it. But it was there were all sorts of conspiracies. Because I was the youngest person on the staff, I got to deal with all the walk-in traffic off the street with people that had transistors in their fillings. They had messages from outer space. I mean, you'd be amazed.
The committee doesn't exist yet.
You'd be amazed at how many unbalanced people there are in society. I mean, I know I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm thinking, this is really, I'm not in Columbus anymore. Anyway, so it turns out that in late February, early March, Liddy puts his whole plan together in a big poster board presentation of what Gemstone's going to look like, who the people are, what they're going to do, how much it's going to cost, what the resources are, and so on. And he presents it to Mitchell and Magruder. And Mitchell, there are more important things at the time, and so he doesn't approve it, but the next meeting he comes back again with his Gemstone plan. And Mitchell says, yeah, okay, fine. It's a budget of $250,000, which in those days was real money. $250,000 to both disrupt the Democratic campaigns and help make George McGovern the nominee, as well as to get political intelligence on the Democrats. And he approves it, as does Magruder. So that's what caused them to begin these break-ins. It turns out then we go to the Watergate break-in itself. Was it the first break-in at the Watergate offices? No. It was the second break-in at the Watergate offices. The very first one happened on May 30th, 1972, when they successfully broke into the committee's offices and placed a listening device, a bug, in Larry O'Brien's phone. Over the next couple of weeks, the information they were getting was very garbled. It wasn't a very good connection. It wasn't transmitting very well, and they were getting very little of it. So Liddy decided they needed to go back in and replace that device or repair it so they would get better communication and presumably better information. So that's why on June 17th they went back in and they were caught. And this is the front page of the Washington Post from June 18th, 72. And the front page story says that 5 were held in a plot to bug the Democrats' office at the Watergate. It's not by Woodward Bernstein, it's by Reginald Lewis, who was a general assignment reporter for the Post. And this occurred the morning after they were caught, with very little information other than they broke in the offices and they were caught. Now, the questions that this article raised pretty obviously are who are these burglars and who sent them, what were they looking for and why? And that's really what takes up the rest of the story. What we know is that the 5 burglars that were caught inside the offices were James McCord, who was the wiretapping specialist, and 4 Cubans, some of whom had been involved in the Bay of Pigs operation before. And in fact, all these guys had worked for the White House plumbers, who we talked about the last time, and had helped to stage the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist that caused the Ellsberg case to be dismissed because of prosecutorial misconduct. The why, we're still trying to understand that because, as we know, by June, it was pretty clear that George McGovern was going to be the Democratic nominee. It was pretty clear that Nixon was going to get reelected overwhelmingly. And it's sort of hard to understand why they would take a risk like this at the time.
We had some theories.
Go ahead.
And the one theory that I worked on as a junior staffer was that Larry O'Brien also had contact with Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes of the big airlines, the movie mogul, the gazillion billionaire, the recluse. Howard Hughes gave $200,000 to Nixon, not the campaign, but to Nixon through an intermediary to use as he saw fit. So there was a lot of cash going around, and I was tasked with following the money. And we followed the money, and we found the money. We found Phoebe Rebozo, and we found the folks who were managing this money and holding it in a safe deposit box or using it to buy jewelry for Trisha, I guess, the girl's jewelry. And Key Biscayne was a home that Nixon had that needed new screens. It was bullshit stuff. But it was still money that was coming to this man. It has strings, and the strings were, as far as they were concerned, what if Larry O'Brien knew about this money and could trace it back to Nixon, and that would be a source of real political embarrassment. So O'Brien was sort of this funny guy. He was at the head of the DNC. He knew what the Democrats were doing strategically, but we also thought it was valid that they continued to look at O'Brien because of what O'Brien knew and who we were sharing it with. And so that never made the public because the hearings were already over with. Our moment had come and gone. This was a little bit far afield, and it was done. So we never actually had hearings around what we thought was an important investigation.
Yeah, Bob.
Question. So when police showed up, they cuffed these guys, fingerprinted them. What was the charge? Was it misdemeanor? Was it
Breaking and entering was the first charge. And the way they got caught is kind of interesting because a security guard at the office building, a man named Frank Wills, was doing his nightly routine. He saw that the locks on the outside door had been taped shut or taped open.
Right.
Right. And so he removed the tape. And then when he came back, half an hour, 45 minutes later, they'd been retaped. So he called the police. The DC police came and arrested them, the 5 burglars in the offices. And across the street, Al Baldwin had been tasked with both observing the burglars and listening to the feedback from above.
Where was he?
He was in the Howard Johnson
Right.
Motel
It's been
across the
McDonald's,
street.
remember there was an old Howard Johnson.
And so when the lights all went out, the last message to him was something along the lines of, "The jig is up."
they were Irish?
Right. Anyway, okay, so right now we don't know anything about these folks apart from their names and James McCord. But immediately the story gets assigned to Bob Woodward on the Metro desk. Woodward is on the left and Bernstein is on the right. They're both on the Metro desk because nobody thought this was a big deal at the time. And all of a sudden, you have a number of different strains that start. One is Woodward and Bernstein start reporting pretty seriously on what's going on. The U.S. attorney was a man named Earl Silber, and he initiated an investigation and a prosecution into the break-in. And at the White House counsel, John Dean, was assigned as the crisis manager. And his basic objective was to keep it out of the White House and to stall the trial until after the elections. So that's what Dean's mission was, given to him by Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He reported to Ehrlichman. Haldeman gave him the assignment that he'd worked out with President Nixon. I apologize, we're sort of doing stories within stories, and it may be confusing, so I apologize if it is. But okay, so we have a couple videos now of participants. Gordon Liddy, it took the Fifth Amendment back when he was caught. He was caught because of the phone numbers in the burglar's phone book. He and Hunt did not go in with the original burglars. And Liddy would never talk. He asserted the Fifth Amendment. He went to trial. He was convicted. He served his time. But later, at the end of his life, we found this interview where he reflected back on what they were trying to do.
The audio is a little bit hard, so listen up.
Yeah.
When I was called in, forget exactly when, by Magruder, and he said, can you get in the Watergate? And I said, well, yeah, we can probably get in the Watergate, but, you know, why get in the Watergate? It's not on the plan. We haven't budgeted for it, and so forth. And he said, well, I want to know what, you know, Brian's got right here. And he took his hand down, he hit his lower drawer in his desk. And I knew that that's where he kept whatever negative information we had about the Democrats in his possession. And I understood that to mean that he wanted to know whatever O'Brien had negative about us. So I said, well, yeah. I said, but, you know, we haven't budgeted this. And I said, we're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul and everything. Well, at any rate, that was the origin of going into the Watergate. Question going in from the very beginning, because I said, you know, there isn't going to be anything there. O'Brien's not there. We intend to get what we can from O'Brien, where O'Brien is, which is going to be in Florida at the convention and so forth. And you're burning up money doing this, which is, we're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. This is going to limit our abilities to do things that have been approved. You know, this was just this wild goose chase as far as I was concerned.
Now, so what you do is you hear Gordon Liddy blaming Jeb Magruder for this, in essence. Does anybody believe Liddy? This is Magruder's fault? No. I mean, I shouldn't say, I should leap to my own conclusion, but Liddy and Magruder hated each other, like you find in most campaigns and most situations where people just can't get along. Liddy was a man of action. Magruder was more laid back in a sense. And Liddy always thought it was Magruder's fault. And Magruder always claimed it was Liddy's.
Well, I want to pipe up for our end of the investigation that, again, I said never got out there. Because Liddy believes that he's getting information that O'Brien has on the Dems' plan.
Right.
But it was just as reasonable to say, they wanted to know what O'Brien knew about the Hughes money. That's what they're really concerned about, because it was $200,000. And we do find the money. It does exist. And so it didn't seem to me that our investigation was off. There just wasn't airtime for it.
Bill?
Quick question. My recollection was Ed Nixon was all involved in this. And that part of the motivation to find out about what was in O'Brien's bottom drawer was because Nixon's brother's fingerprints were all over this thing.
This is chatting
Right. It's
Okay, so-
Don Nixon.
All right, Don Nixon is a character. He's a source of embarrassment. All the presidents seem to have a brother that's going to be a source of embarrassment, right? And Don
It's a requirement for the office.
So this comes back to Howard Hughes again. This comes back to Hughes money in Hollywood. Don Nixon thinks he's going to make it big in Hollywood, and he's doing pornographic movies. So I was tasked with interviewing Rita Murray and John Meyer and the folks who worked with him. The name of the movie was
Swamp Trash.
Swamp Trash. And they had these big Afghan dogs. Well, in any event, where did he get the money? Who were his contacts? They go back to the back door of, again, Howard Hughes. And O'Brien may have known about it. So that was part of our Hughes-O'Brien investigation. But again, it doesn't get the airwaves. It's not Watergate. It's just another thing that may have been going on. You know?
Right.
But I think that's, how did you, Bill, how did you have the connection with Ed Nixon? What do you remember? Because,
That is Don.
I mean, excuse me, Don.
He's
I had no
remember.
connection with either of them.
No. I mean,
You were living in a swamp.
I became research director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for the '74 election.
Okay.
I was involved in it with the Democratic congressional side from '73. Spencer Oliver is a close friend of mine, who was
It was also Bud.
He was also bugged, and he resisted settling all the way through. And then I'm a campaign finance specialist, so part of what these guys were doing with CREEP was, and the separate office Muskie had and everyone else, came out of campaign finance laws, which required full disclosure, April 7th, '72. And that whole funny money stuff was part and parcel of what Nixon did in 1970 in the Senate and with Operation Townhouse. And two of the indicted conspirators in that are friends of mine too.
interesting. So you can see the mindset, you can see how money does corrupt, and how you begin to believe that what you're doing makes perfect sense because your end is to get someone elected.
Right. And
That's interesting.
the Kennedy campaign in '60 was floating in all sorts of cash.
But it was so much classier. I'm really being so good.
Well, they didn't violate the laws because the laws didn't exist.
That's right.
Right.
Okay, well, and same with the Nixon campaign in '60. There was a lot of cash floating around that. And there was cash floating around in '68, which resulted in the campaign finance laws. '70 that resulted in the disclosure and operation of separate
So
committees.
this is interesting.
Aside from Hatch Act.
So they're really functioning, the 72 campaign is really functioning under different
Yeah.
legislative
Yeah,
mandates.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, well, I think that's interesting to point out, I wasn't familiar.
Really?
Yeah, no.
Oh, and there was a huge driver as to why all this came out.
The other thing I wanted to mention was the ramp, and Mary talked about her role in the Hughes Rebozo investigation, which is very significant. We issued a subpoena for the $200,000 in cash that he allegedly kept in the safe deposit box. And Rebozo and his lawyer kept stonewalling us. And we finally had to threaten that if he didn't show up and produce the cash, at the next executive committee hearing, we were going to hold him in contempt, which we didn't really want to do because it's a very long process. We'd much rather just get the money itself. So as his lawyer and Rebozo come into the committee, the lawyer starts objecting to everything and starts raising his voice and almost yelling at our boss, Lenzner, and Scott Armstrong, and Carmen Molino. And Mary is sitting there as well. I was not part of this interview formally. I just read the transcript. So the lawyer says, I've never been treated this badly. And that includes you, Mr. Lenzner, and you, Mr. Molino, and you, Mr. Armstrong. And stopped, and Terry said, well, you forgot about Ms. Diorio.
My boss.
And without missing a beat, he said, oh, Ms. Diorio is just a sweet young girl.
Oh, and therein laid my power.
Which, anyway.
So should we move along here?
All right, let's move along. So our next video is from a fellow named Tim Naftali. He was the executive director of the Nixon Foundation, an academic, and we saw him in our last session as part of the panel holding forth on Richard Nixon. And Tim has put all this in context about the plumbers and the White House and creep. And I thought it was quite
This is
insightful.
chronology. What we're going through is Tim's chronology.
Yeah.
What we're going through is Tim's chronology of the events.
Right.
You can listen to the president himself, who was interviewed after he left office, not by us, but by the private Nixon Foundation. He talks about dirty tricks.
This sort of thing happens in campaigns. I don't particularly like it, particularly when it happens to me, and I don't like to see that be interjected in what should be particularly a high-level presidential campaign. But it's going to happen because people are human.
Here you get a sense of the extent to which the White House was involved in illegal campaign activities, the fact that the Hunt and Liddy Cuban emigre team that first makes its appearance on this timeline wall in 1971 has reappeared in the story of these illegal activities. Well, that sets you up for the break-in and the consequences of the break-in, because the Hunt and Liddy team get a $250,000 budget to engage in surreptitious entry, and legal bugging, and dirty tricks for the 72 campaign. And they break into the Watergate. The Watergate is where the Democratic National Committee was. They break in once, they successfully break in. They put in a couple of listening devices, but the take isn't very good. And so they decide to break in again on the night of June 17th, 16th, 17th, 1972. They're captured early in the morning of June 17th. Now that you've sort of have a sense of who Hunt is, who the Cubans are, what Liddy's up to, and the extent to which the White House, not just the president, but those around him, are linked, you get a sense then of how terrifying for the White House the failed break-in would be when these Cubans are captured. And the question is, will the FBI and the U.S. Attorney be able to make the connection between that group and Hunt and Liddy. And of course, if they make the link to Hunt and Liddy, can they make the link back to the committee to re-elect the president? And if they make the link to the committee to re-elect the president, can they actually link Hunt and Liddy back to the operations of the plumbers unit, including the illegal break-in at Dr. Fielding's office? And can they link Hunt to the operations that the president ordered Chuck Colson to undertake, and Colson used Hunt for some of them? That's the challenge for the White House, and that's why, as we lay out for you here, that's why the White House undertakes an extensive cover-up. Indeed, we quote from President Nixon's memoirs, where he writes, "If the CIA could deflect the FBI from Hunt, they would thereby protect us from the only White House vulnerability involving Watergate that I was worried about exposing. Not the break-in, but the political activities Hunt had undertaken for Colson." Well, this timeline lays out for you what the president meant and the vulnerability that existed for him as a result of the failed second break-in of the Watergate facility.
Okay. Any comments or reactions to that exposition of the connections? I mean, in retrospect, it's all remarkably clear. At the time, and bear in mind that we still don't have a Senate Watergate Committee. We don't have a staff. We don't have any members. It's still very early on. It wasn't that obvious to anybody at the beginning. I've already told you about some of the theories that I had to investigate. There were all kinds of theories floating around and all kinds of people spouting them. And so Woodward and Bernstein, to their credit, kept their eye on the ball and continued to report. And most of the revelations in the campaign, during the campaign, were from them. But it was also a time where young journalists were trying to get established. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a couple
Although
more slides.
I did want to comment about Leslie Stahl, because she too was there the day the Woodward Bernstein were there covering just this break-in. And she looked over and said, well, wait a minute, these guys are from the Metropolitan Desk. I at least sit up at a more important desk for my network. But something's going here. The two of them could see that this is more than just a break-in. But they were juniors. They were just kids at their newspapers and television stations. And they also make a name and a reputation. Connie Chung as well. They also make their reputation by doggedly staying with the story, but then again becomes the story.
How far ahead were you in front of these journalists?
No, we're behind.
We're way behind.
The committee doesn't even exist at this point.
Yeah, the committee, we're going to get to the committee in just a couple of minutes.
Well, we end with the committee, so we're on our way for a committee to happen. It hasn't happened yet.
So the prosecutors are in the U.S. Attorney's Office, which reports to the Justice Department, as part of the Justice Department. And the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia at that point is a fellow by the name of Earl Silber. And one of the questions always was, why didn't the prosecutors discover the connections between the burglars and the White House? Why did it take so long for that to come out? And I think what we decided, we would let Earl explain in his own words what they were up to and why they.
To this day, I think the question of the motive for the break-in is uncertain. To this day, 35 years later. There have been lawsuits and claims about various reasons and all, and we certainly did look into it as best we could. And the Cubans were in there, according to them, to find out information relating to relations between the Larry O'Brien and Castro and communism, and where McCord and Hunt and Liddy were coming from with respect to the information that they were looking for it just didn't make sense. And the information they were getting, and there's a court order, so I have to be careful about what I can say about that, was, it just didn't spell out a motive. And as I said, now there are some subsequent claims about other motivations leading to defamation and allegations of, prostitution rings and the like. We asked everybody, but we certainly didn't get any clear answers.
I have a question.
Mary?
Going back to the qubits, so did they each have a specific goal, or was one good with, keeping doors open and the other had?
Yes, the short answer is yes. They each had specialties. I can't remember which ones were which, but they operated as a unit, and Howard Hunt had recruited them for the plumbers in the White House, and they helped break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. So
that was the Dr. Fielding that he referenced. Fielding is Ellsberg.
And so, yes, they did have separate specialties, and they operated as a team together. One of the things that, excuse me, one of the things that I thought was interesting was just as the various actors talked about their roles, and Silver talked. I mean, I think, Bill, your friend Spencer Oliver, one of the big allegations at the time was that he was running a prostitution ring. And ironically, his secretary came to work for the Senate Watergate Committee. And when these allegations came up, we talked to her separately and said, and she said, oh, bullshit, basically. And I'm sure Spencer says that even today.
Well, Spencer insists it never came out because one of the allegations was that Maureen Dean was one of the women. I mean,
We'll meet her later on, yes.
Long drunken night with Spencer, it's fascinating. He wasn't a pimp for a network in Washington.
Right. Anyway, so over the summer, this is what happened. 2 weeks after the break-in, John Mitchell and Hugh Sloan both resigned. Mitchell because he's asked to by the president, and Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
I just want to be sure, everybody please note, this is 1972, not 1973. This is still the summer. Shortly after,
72.
really early.
Yes. So Mitchell resigns because he's requested to, and Hugh Sloan, as I mentioned earlier, discovered what some of the money was used for, and he decides he's going to get out of Dodge. Turns out that Hugh Sloan cooperated with the prosecutors and the special prosecutor, who are coming later on, and then went to Canada and became a very successful business executive in Canada, and nobody has heard from him again, literally. It turns, and we know what happened to Mitchell. I'll come back to Mitchell because I had an experience with him while we were preparing for John Dean that comes up a little bit later in the chronology, but I won't muddy it any more than I have. So it wasn't until September of '72 that the burglars, Hunt and Liddy, were all indicted for breaking and entering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and a couple other things, but it didn't go above Hunt and Liddy, which the White House was very grateful for, and which John Dean was thanked by Haldeman and Haldeman and the president for preventing this from getting any closer. And we'll hear about that next week.
Was that a federal indictment or was it a DC indictment? Remember?
I'm pretty sure it was a DC indictment at the time. I'm not 100% positive, Gene. It's a good question, though. Okay, so at the same time, Woodward Bernstein reported that there was $350,000 found in Maurice Stan's safe. Now, anytime you find lots of cash in a campaign, it's not a good thing. It's hard to trace cash, and nobody has very good records for it. We fortunately had a forensic accountant by the name of Carmine Bellino, and he was a specialist in reassembling expenditures and bank accounts. But we didn't know, we didn't find out about this for a while anyway. But the other important factor is that a fellow by the name of Donald Segretti was hired by Dwight Chapin to set up a dirty tricks operation for CREEP, as well as what Liddy and his group were doing with the Gemstone group. Now, later on, when Segretti is discovered by Woodward and Bernstein, there was a brief moment when everybody thought that Segretti had masterminded the Watergate break-in. And when we first started on our investigation, I flew out to California to interview Segretti. And we assumed that this was going to be a very sophisticated, very thoughtful, bright, competent fellow. It turns out he was anything but. He was holed up in an apartment near Santa Monica and only had a couple operatives. He didn't have the 6 or 7 or 8 that they thought earlier. He had this little network, and it was doing what it was supposed to do. It had infiltrated campaigns, it had sent pizzas to campaigns, it had made phone calls, bogus phone calls, it had planted stories with newspapers, that kind of thing. Nothing particularly harmful and nothing particularly significant or expensive for that matter. So after the summer and the fall, and none of the stories are affecting this, the election occurs, and sure enough, it's a landslide where Nixon and Agnew are reelected with over 60% of the popular vote and winning every state but one and the District of Columbia. So George McGovern got a total of 17 electoral votes that year. Now, it's because of the politics and the circumstances of the time, it's hard to believe that they could be very concerned about what McGovern knew, what Larry O'Brien knew, any of the political intelligence, because it was such a landslide. But nevertheless, that's what happened at that point. So now we're coming up to after the election. The first date should be January 8th, 1973, not 72. Because that's just a typo, our typo. It turns out that 4 of the suspects plus Howard Hunt plead guilty in early January 72.
So it's like 3 months after this landslide, right? I'm sorry.
They're pleading guilty.
So they don't enjoy this for very long.
But Liddy and McCord insist on going to trial. McCord, because he's concerned that they are blaming all this on the CIA, and he has just retired from the CIA and really loves the institution, and has threatened that if they try and hang it on the CIA, that a lot of trees are going to fall in the forest. And he comes back later on in March with a letter to Judge Sirica. The other ones, McCord and Liddy, go to trial. Neither one testifies very much. They don't have any kind of a defense. And at the end of January in 73, they're both found guilty. And so, in essence, by that point, this whole thing has been contained, and the cover-up's been very successful. During the late winter in 73, Dean is still successfully managing the cover-up inside the White House. Nobody has cast any aspersions on either the president, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell. None of them have been accused of anything other than just speculation. And the committee hasn't been set up. But the first week in February, there's a lot of concern.
I'm sorry.
Which week? Yeah.
I should have gone to the committee, yeah.
Okay. First week in February, the Senate votes unanimously to set up a bipartisan committee to investigate this, a select committee, not a standing committee, but a select committee, which has a life of only 1 year in the enabling resolution. And so the committee is formed. How do they decide who to pick? Well, they Senator Mike Mansfield was the majority leader in the Senate, and he picked Sam Ervin to chair the committee because Ervin was the most respected Democrat among the Republicans, which translates into meaning that he voted with the Republicans about 30% of the time, which is about the highest of any of the Democratic senators. And the Republicans picked for their ranking member, Howard Baker from Tennessee. He was a young, rising star. Now I want to identify the other members of the committee. If we start on the left, at the far end is Senator Lowell Weicker. He is a moderate to liberal Republican from Connecticut. Next to him is Senator Ed Gurney from Florida, who was a very conservative senator and subsequently indicted himself for corruption and taking illegal bribes. And he did some time in jail. The chief counsel, the chief minority counsel, he's not assistant chief counsel, he's the chief minority counsel, is Fred Thompson, who's next. You may recognize from his subsequent political career, he became a senator from Tennessee. He was Howard Baker's campaign manager, had been a successful trial lawyer in Tennessee, and was only 30 years old when he got appointed to this position.
He also had a Hollywood career. In Law and Order.
Right.
Very convincing.
And in a
Best
couple
part.
movies.
Yeah.
He usually played himself, which was as a country lawyer with a drawl.
He was playing himself when I was in an elevator with him.
Oh, no, you don't mean that literally.
Thank you, Joyce. Then you get Chairman Ervin in the middle there, and he enjoyed playing the folksy country lawyer role immensely.
And was he
In fact, off camera, he was exactly the same way. He was folksy, he was charming, he would cite the Bible as often as he would cite the law.
And he carried the Constitution.
Yeah, at one point I had a confrontation with a reporter that was somewhat, I thought, potentially embarrassing to the committee. So I went up to Ervin's office to explain it to him and to seek his counsel on what I should do. This was a fellow named Bill Sapphire, who was writing a column in the New York Times. And Senator Ervin looked at me and said, "Well, Bob, you should never get into a pissing contest with a skunk." which I thought was a marvelous attitude that I've always carried out. Anyway, so those are the members of the committee. It gets set up.
Well, if you haven't gone through,
Oh, I haven't done the rest. Okay, then we've got our chief counsel, Sam Dash, who's pictured there right next to Ervin. Sam was a law professor in Georgetown, had been the Philadelphia district attorney when he was very young, and then went into academia. And the only reason that Sam got the job, he hadn't applied for it, was that Senator Ervin and his staff thought that this was basically a wiretapping case. It wasn't a corruption case. It wasn't a political, it was a wiretapping case. Sam was an expert on wiretapping. He'd written a book called The Eavesdroppers. He was the country's leading authority on wiretapping. And he'd never conducted an investigation like this before, but Ervin thought he would be ideal because he wasn't political and his credibility wouldn't be challenged. Next to Sam Dash was Herman Talmadge from Georgia. He's from the Talmadge political dynasty in Georgia. His father was Eugene Talmadge, one of the most rabid segregationists that existed in the Democratic Party back then. And Talmadge, too, would be charged with corruption when investigators found hundreds of thousands of dollars of $100 bills stuffed in his coat and his suits and his closet when they inspected his premises later on under subpoena. So he wasn't exactly, although at the time nobody suspected any of this. Senator Inouye was from Hawaii, a young rising star who had his arm shot off in World War II and who Senator Ervin liked to refer to as the strong right arm of the Senate. As he kept teasing, he would tease Inouye, and Inouye would take it usually with a grain of salt. And finally, over here, the junior senator from New Mexico, Senator Joe Montoya, was the last member of the committee. What were the reason Montoya was included? Not clear to anybody. In fact, his nickname at the committee was Senator Montoilet. And the reason for that was because every time he would start questioning anybody, it would be repetitive of what had happened before. He would be reading from a script, so he wouldn't be listening to the answers to follow up. And people would take toilet breaks. So he was known as Senator Montoilet. What were the requirements to be on the committee? It was said Senator Ervin didn't want to have anybody with presidential ambitions, and none of these Democratic senators did. The Republicans, however, didn't understand that Lowell Weicker at the time hadn't read the Constitution and still thought he was going to be a candidate for president. Weicker was born in France, and so it was pretty clear from the clause in the Constitution requiring birthright citizenship that, and the president had to be born in the United States, that he probably wouldn't be eligible to be president. But it was important for the majority staff to know that Senator Weicker was a potential vote on many of these issues because he was quite ambitious. So at the time, nobody understood how ambitious Weicker was, but he became a very effective member of the committee, both because he lived in the same apartment building as John Dean, had a number of meetings with him off where nobody else was present, and was getting information from Dean that he was funneling back to the committee. He also was his office was also a major source of leaks to the press, which come up a little bit later.
Was he also getting information back up to the White House?
He may have been. We don't think he was, but we don't know. In this situation, everybody sort of works both sides of the street, so it's nobody's clean and nobody's completely dirty. It's usually a combination of the two.
Can I ask a question? Was Howard Baker as much of a straight arrow as people were creating?
No, absolutely not. In fact, that was a big challenge. I mentioned in the last session that one of our investigators followed his administrative assistant after we had a meeting to the White House and then called Fred Bizarre's office. Fred was the White House counsel who replaced Dean, and asked for the administrative assistant. And when he got on the phone, he said, "God damn it, Scott," and he hung up the phone. The problem we had with being bipartisan was that the Republicans were funneling a lot of information to the White House. And it's really hard, as you know, it's really hard to do an investigation when the target of the investigation knows ahead of time where you're going and what you're looking for. So we had to be particularly careful. We've talked about the committee and who the other thing, they didn't want to find any grandstanders, and the closest thing to a grandstander would have been Weicker and Baker. None of the Democrats, apart from Ervin, if you want to think of him that way, was a grandstander. But part of the story behind the staff was that Senator Ervin had two subcommittees of the Judiciary Committee that he was chairing. One had a fellow named Larry Baskier, and the other one had a fellow named Rufus Edmiston, who were their chief of staff and chief counsel. Both of them wanted the job to be chief counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee. Sam Dash was sort of the outside candidate that had been discovered by one of Ervin's consultants. Rufus called Sam Dash and said, "Look, Sam, if you're become chief counsel, will you make me your deputy? I'll promote you as Senator Ervin if you do." And Dash by this point, wanted the job and said, sure, that'd be really helpful. So Rufus pitched Irvin to not make any of his current chief counsels the chief counsel of the Watergate Committee, but to go with the outsider. And then Sam immediately appointed Rufus as his deputy chief counsel. You may recall in the hearings, I don't have a picture of it here, we don't have a picture of it here, but Rufus had a special chair made for him to slide behind all the committee members and be wherever the photographers were. And the net of it was that there were more pictures of Rufus than anybody else during the time of the hearings. And Rufus used that as a platform to run for Attorney General back in North Carolina after the committee disbanded. But then he was elected, but then he was prosecuted for tax fraud because he hadn't paid his taxes in North Carolina for a number of years. Anyway, it's pretty clear that we weren't exactly clean ourselves. I mean, we had a lot of problems in our closets as well.
I think we've spoken to all of this.
Okay, so now we've got Sam and Fred are both appointed. I want to go back to how the staff was then selected. We had the formation of the committee staff. The majority got 2/3 of the committee staff. The minority got 1/3 of the committee staff, which is good because we needed a lot of people. We hired a bunch of lawyers and investigators and researchers to put that together. And they came from all different walks. Curiously, the first person that Sam Dash wanted to hire after we were formed was Bob Woodward. And he reached out to Bob Woodward and asked him to be his chief investigator. And Woodward said, well, thanks, Sam, but I've got a day job and, but I have a really good guy that you might want to hire. His name is Scott Armstrong. He was a high school classmate and behind me at Yale by a year or two. And so that's how our colleague Scott Armstrong got hired. Sam also then decided to hire 3 assistant chief counsels, Terry Lenzner, David Dorson, and Jim Hamilton, and divided the investigation into 3 separate parts. It was going to be the Watergate break-in and the cover-up, the political dirty tricks that we thought were, at the time, more significant than they were, and campaign finance. And Dorson opted for campaign finance. Lenzner wanted the political dirty tricks. And Jim Hamilton received the Watergate break-in and cover-up investigations. It was pretty clear very soon after we were formed that the Watergate break-in and cover-up were going to subsume everything. And so Sam decided that we would hold off on dirty tricks and hold off on campaign finance until after the hearings. And so all of us got a chance to work with the targets and the witnesses for the first part of the hearing, which was fortunate because we needed everybody. We had about a total staff of professionals on our side of about 20. The Republicans had 6 or 7. And that's how we set up the investigation initially, was to do it that third. We also, early on, had a little dinner retreat where we identified who the key witnesses were going to be and who around them we should interview beforehand. We called it a satellite chart because these were secretaries, assistants, chiefs of staff, etc. And for each major witness we had at least 5 or 6 people around them that we could talk to first before we interviewed the principal. So we would know something about them, about how they kept track of their appointments, how they kept track of the money they spent, how they noted or summarized the meetings that they attended, how their filing system worked, all that kind of thing. So we would have that information ahead of time. But it meant there were a huge number of interviews that we had to do. Initially, I did them with Terry because I was young and Terry was experienced. And I could learn from him how to do interviews. It got back to journalism in a sense, which was who, what, when, where, and why. And if you just remembered that order of questions, you could do a pretty good job of draining the information. We also.
And were they required to answer?
I'm sorry?
Were they required to answer?
No, they weren't, but if they wanted to, we weren't going to have anybody testify publicly that asserted the Fifth Amendment.
Okay.
So what we did in the situation, if they asserted, we're going to assert the Fifth Amendment, we had to decide whether to grant them immunity or not. And immunity means you couldn't prosecute them for what they were testifying to, or it would violate their Fifth Amendment rights. But we could compel them to testify by granting them immunity. And so that's what we did in a number of cases, most notably with John Dean and Jeff Magruder and James McCord. So that's how we formed the committee staff. Why don't we move on to, okay, now, questions we want to answer here. How is it conducted? How do we manage the information and share? How can we have bipartisan cooperation when one side is leaking to the targets? And how do we resolve questions like the witness list and the order of the questions? Mary, do you want to talk about the computer?
At the time, we've mentioned all the different sources of information, whether they're interviews or documents or credit card records or telephone records. But what do you do with all this? You've got to put it into some kind of a manageable format. There were a group of people, and I was one of them, who were hired just to do that, to read and to summarize the document, whatever it was, into a computerized format that would then be put on a punch card that would be collected and then sent to this computer. It was an IBM, what was it? Oh, an IBM S37, I'm looking right at it. It was huge. It was in a room that needed to be air conditioned, that needed to be secured so people could get in it. And it really, there were, I only saw it once. All the documents, all the not credit cards, punch cards would be put together and sent over there. You couldn't just blabber it in. You had to dictate into a format so that when we would query the computer, that you want to know, where is Lynn and Bob on this date? Where were they meeting? What did they spend? Who did they call? You could ask that question in the computer. It doesn't seem like a very big deal right now when you can do it on your phone. But it was a big deal. And the document was anything but manageable. It was very wide with punch holes down the side. And there would be reams and reams of it. So yes, now you have a tiny package. This is the chronology of where Bill was, or this is the money that Richard spent. But you still have to put the narrative together. You still have to create the questions. You still have to make sense of it. And does it even support what your thoughts were prior to even asking the question? It was a really cool, it was a great opportunity to see how you put all of this together and make some kind of a story out of it. Was it bipartisan? To a degree it was. Anything that went into the public domain, so if it was actually a summary later on, a summary of a hearing or an interview, we were conducting these interviews with a Republican and a Democrat. It would be very rare. Am I right, Chris?
Yeah.
Where you would have only one.
No, we had, our marching orders were to always have a Republican with us. And we would usually have 2 Democratic staffers and 1 Republican.
Right.
To assure there was bipartisan cooperation.
And I wasn't allowed, Mark and I were living together at the time. And Sam knew that. We didn't hide it. But Sam said, you may never work with Mark. You may never travel with him. You may never do an interview with him. Nothing. So I asked Scotty, the guy that Woodward suggested. And he's a fabulous investigator, but he didn't begin to have the discipline or the know-how that Terry Lansner had. I was with Mr. Crazy Man over here, chasing whatever we were going to chase, and it was a totally different experience than ours. But then I didn't have a reputation to protect.
At the beginning of our investigation, when I arrived, all we didn't have a computer yet. Yeah. All we had was a file filled with newspaper articles. and they hadn't been systematically
You
organized.
had indictments, you had the stuff that had gone on in the
And
court.
yes, we had the transcripts of the trial, but that they were relatively worthless. So we had to organize the newspaper reports and create a chronology initially, and then we would build on that. Lynn.
So what about the analysis? You know, I understand the queries,
Yes,
but was there a Republican or a Democrat involved in the
good point.
analyzing?
Not
what's
necessarily, well, not together, because I might see something and get from it something totally different than a Republican would, because we're looking for different things. I'm looking for stuff that's going to incriminate, and they're looking for stuff that's
So
going
did
to.
they do a separate report list?
They did issue
Yeah,
a separate
yeah, they
report,
did.
Brought it all
but it
together.
didn't. It really went off on a different tangent, and
Oh.
But that's at the end of it. That's
Yes,
like a
right.
whole year later. At this point, you take your information and we get it into preparing for hearings.
So what you're saying is there was not really bipartisan cooperation in the investigation?
there was and there wasn't. You know, it was this sort of, yes, there was cooperation up to a point. And
Well,
then,
who's going to lead it? For instance, you want to interview so-and-so, and the Republican counterpart says, well, why would you want to interview so-and-so? He's got nothing to say, but you want to do it anyway. Well, so we're the majority, we're going to pull it, we're going to get that interview, and they will reluctantly attend with us, right?
Why were Democrats the majority if wasn't
Not
well,
necessarily.
the committee had 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. But the rules of the committee were that significant decisions, issuing a subpoena, for example, designating a witness to testify publicly, had to be approved by 2/3 of the committee.
But remind Lynn who was in charge of the Senate, and that's
The Democrats were the majority at the time
It's
of
a
the Senate.
Democratic committee. The administration is Republican,
Yeah.
but the investigative body,
was the Senate?
which is not the case in today's world. Today, all 3 are being head up by
Well, just so it happens.
Republicans.
It doesn't necessarily happen that way, so.
No, but
Right.
you can just see, that's exactly right, that's the balance.
But it also meant that we had to get at least 1 Republican vote for everything. So one of the things we did early on was to draft a model subpoena that called for all kinds of books, records, documents, diaries, bank accounts, phone records, etc., that we would issue to everybody we interviewed. And they would then be required to produce all that material either before or after.
Right.
Right.
Well, so if you get somebody's calendar, on their, in those days, these are hard calendars, you would see that Comback is meeting with LaRue, who's met with, so you can see, you can piece this story together. You've got to do it, but you can piece the story together, the narrative is there.
And the benefits of the computer, this is the very first time that Congress had used a computer in an investigation. And what we were trying to do was to be able to create a chronology, so we continue to know what happened when, a witness file, so we know what that witness was involved in, and a subject matter file. So when we got the printout from the computer, it would have each of those separately on this big, broad paper that was very hard to unwieldy and hard to manage. I mean, it wasn't like, it was printed out on 8.5 by 11 paper like we have today. And one of the things that happened pretty early on was to realize that we had a bit of a culture clash between the good old boys from North Carolina and these Eastern elite types that were hard chargers, wanting more, not taking no for an answer, and just charging ahead. And it was like there were 2 different worlds. There was the world of Senator Ervin and his personal staff, and there was the world of the committee and the committee staff, and they didn't overlap a huge amount. Rufus Edmiston was the only overlap in a sense. And curiously, we didn't have a press secretary either. It was all Rufus. In fact, we were directed early on to not speak with the press. And if we had any inquiries from the press, we were to direct them to Rufus.
And I just want to make a point that isn't obvious if you haven't worked on the Hill before. You have the senator, and the senator has his own personal staff. That staff works with constituent mails, the questions that are relevant to their area, and they're all about the senator. Now, that senator is also going to have committee responsibilities. He's on agriculture. So he'll have somebody on his committee that is that agriculture point person. Well, then you have a select committee. As Mark said, it lives for 1 year by vote. Now the senators associated with this committee will hire, possibly, or assign within their own personal staff someone who will represent them, not physically in the committee room where the staff is, but they will be the ones at the end of the day that will gather the information, get it back to their senator. So once the hearings are started, you've got the questions, whatever else. Meanwhile, you have a committee, a select committee staff. That's what we're on. We're there because we're hired by the Sam Dashes and the Terrys of the world, not by the senators. We are staff to this committee. We only exist for this committee. When this committee is disbanded, we have to go find another job.
So are we.
So are we. That's exactly right. So you can see you've got the senator's personal person who in fact is going to be on most of the TV screens. He'll sit right behind the senator and look like he has done a 24-hour rotation the night before to get this great hearing out. No, he was nowhere near the preparation for the hearing. He merely got the book you spent all night long putting together so his senator can have a smart question. It's okay, but a lot of it's all behind the scenes. You know, they're the ones. I was part of that group.
Not only for that, but also for Anita Hill. But we won't go into that.
No, that's a whole other.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about, I don't want to go to that quite
Oh,
yet.
sorry, that's the last slide.
Where was our computer, well, where was our staff headquartered? We had trouble finding space for our staff, only because all the Senate offices were occupied. Sam Dash and Fred Thompson shared an office on the first floor of the Dirksen building. And that actually was a fairly good thing because they had to get along. They shared secretaries and they had to get along. The rest of us, fortunately, right before I showed up, the Senate agreed to provide the Senate auditorium for our staff. So they had to take out about a third of the seats in the auditorium and put up green.
Well, first it was G308, that was the room number. And there was an anteroom where all of the secretaries would sit and the punch card ladies. And then you go through, you start going downhill because it's an auditorium. It's freezing cold because they used the same old system as though 700 people would be in there. But it was just the 35 of us. They had to build a floor. They had to put up the green fiberglass partitions. And you could sort of look over them and yell at each other. At the end of this room, that's right. And at the end of this room was a beautiful solid wood dais where you would have the important people sit. Well, behind that was this cage, this grated area where behind the scenes people would be. Well, that's where Terry and Jim Hamilton and Dorsey put their offices. So if Terry was smoking his cigar, it's coming through this grate, polluting the area that we're sitting in, because there's a bunch of us sitting at the dais that are just reading documents, and then you go up to the soundproof rooms where the projectors were, and you record into your recorder into this computerized format, whatever the heck it was. And so it was a funny sort of unofficial, crazy, all just stitched together room where all the activity is happening. And this parenthetically, at the end of the committee, it's all put back into an auditorium. And within 6 months later, Senator Frank Church begins the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which I also had the fun to work on. They took the damn thing all apart again and put it right back up like it used to be. So that's your taxpayer dollars.
It was our introduction into government efficiency.
Shall we talk about planes?
So did you want to go into the witness list in the order of questions?
Well, actually, I want to talk a little bit about go back to bipartisanship. Initially, when the committee got together, okay, this will be the last topic we'll cover today. Initially, when the committee first met, the White House had requested through Senator Baker that we have a witness list that consisted just of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Chuck Colson, John Mitchell, and then John Dean. And that would be our hearing. And Baker made a big pitch at our first committee meeting that that's all we really needed to do, was to have 5 witnesses. And then we could be done and write our report. Well, we had a different perspective. And even though Senator Ervin had said to us that he hoped that this would not lead to President Nixon, there were a lot of signs heading in that direction. And so Sam Dash pushed to Senator Ervin and said, no, we've got to do it the other way around. We've got to go from the lower level people up to mid-level people up to, and then finish with John Dean and then Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell. There were 2 theories of the case. Our theory was that Dean was telling the truth and that Haldeman and Ehrlichman and maybe the president were involved. The Republican theory of the case was that it was all Dean. John Dean had managed the cover-up and was continuing to blame others for what he had done. In a sense, that's true. Dean ended up getting immunity from us for his testimony, but we'll cover that in the next session. So the Republicans had a witness list of 5 witnesses for the whole hearings. We had a witness list that started off with about 16 or 20. And it got a little bit more as the investigation went on. Part of the challenge was that when Senator Ervin insisted we start the hearings by May 17th. And the reason for that was we had a window before the Memorial Day recess, and it was to show that we were active and making progress. The challenge was that we were not anywhere close to finishing our investigation. So it meant that we were going to have to put on hearings, public hearings, at the same time that we're going to continue to do our investigation.
Was there a competition for airtime in those days?
There's a competition for everything. And specifically, all these reporters that were hovering around the committee needed their airtime. We needed airtime.
What about the daytime soaps?
Yeah, well, the concern was that there would be a backlash if the networks televised this because they would be preempting the daytime soap operas. So it turns out the networks rotated who was covering the hearings on a particular day, and PBS, to its credit, broadcast from gavel to gavel the entire set of hearings, and they're still available. We've tried to go through some of them. And so when you get to the first hearing,
that's what the room looked like.
That's what the room looked like. It was about 85 degrees inside the room because of all the clean lights and the small space.
No, that's the room where, the freezing room is the room where we investigated. This is the room where it happened. You see the senators over there, Bill
On the right.
See them on the right. The cameras are focusing on those dudes, but behind them are all the people that have come in and out. They take turns, they move them in and out because there are citizens that want to see. And then there's a huge bank of photographers, and then the witness table you can see with the microphones. And then it got to the point also where photographers would sit on the floor in front of that table, shooting up at.
Right. That's right. The witness table's at the left there. It's got 2 empty chairs in front of it. It's at the left of the center.
It's right in the center.
And they haven't called Rob Odell yet, who was the first witness.
That's it.
Okay, let me pause there, see if there are comments.
Where was this room?
This room is in the Russell.
In the Russell building of the Senate.
It's a beautiful building.
It's the caucus room. in the Russell building, and its other claim to fame is it's where the Army McCarthy hearings were held in the 50s. And
You wouldn't know about it.
we had to watch some of Edward R. Murrow's program, See It Now, when he explained what McCarthy was up to. It was in this hearing room where Joe Welch asked Senator McCarthy, did he have no shame, did he have no
Sense of
decency?
Any questions, you guys? I think we have to wrap up.
I think that covers what we wanted to cover today. Thank you all very much for participating.